colleagues envied Zoe. Your husband is handsome, smart, businesslike. He provides for the family. What are you always dissatisfied with? That was certainly true, but no one considered the other side of the coin. For a long time now, this handsome womanizer had been coming home whenever he wanted. His phone was constantly getting calls from girls. In the morning he looked at his wife as if it was her who had been out yesterday. The girls at the barbershop where she worked were certainly right. The family existed on Jason's earnings. Zoe and her daughter did not need anything, but there was no happiness in the family. And Zoe was the only one who knew what a difficult life she had to live. Zoe was brought up in an orphanage from the age of 3, right after the death of her parents. The teachers loved the very modest and intelligent girl. Since she was a child, Zoe loved learning new things, studying, and reading a lot. Immediately after graduation, she had no problem entering university and hoped to get a good education. But life decided differently. When she had just turned 18, she met Jason by chance. They bumped into each other in the doorway of the grocery store, and the tall, handsome man apologetically began to help pick up the girl's fallen-out purchases. "I'm sorry, for God's sake. I'm very guilty, and I suggest you give me a chance to make amends. May I walk you out?" The young man spoke in a pleasant voice. Zoe blushed with embarrassment but agreed. Her heart was beating with excitement. She could not take her eyes off his beautiful dark hair, amazing look, and charming smile. Jason was 6 years older than Zoe, but she even liked it. After all, he seemed so mature, intelligent, and reliable that after a few meetings she was ready to follow him to the edge of the world. They were very different. Jason was a tall, charming, brown-haired humorist and joker. The young man was a lover of power and wealth. Zoe, on the contrary, was a pretty short blonde, looking like a porcelain statuette. She was accustomed to living modestly. She could make do with little money. She was also the exact opposite of his character, quiet, modest, and not fond of loud companies. When they say, opposites attract, it seems to be about such couples. When Jason began courting Zoe, he spared no expense. He tried to guess the girl's every wish, to pamper her with something unusual, and almost every day he brought her a bouquet of flowers. Sometimes it seemed to Zoe that this was a dream or a fairy tale. No one had ever cared for her like that. In fact, the guy turned her head. A few months after they met, Jason proposed to Zoe, and they had a modest but fun wedding. Only close friends from both sides were invited, and the groom, being in a great mood, took on the role of toastmaster. The girl was already imagining how they would have a big friendly family with a bunch of little kids. But Jason avoided the subject, saying that they would have children, but a little later. He said they needed to live for themselves. But Zoe often returned to this. "Jason, let's have a baby. I will take care of and love him or her very much." Her husband sometimes got angry and answered, "Well, is there any urgency about children? Think about what we will live on, what to eat. Bonnets and diapers, we would have to buy all these things. I want to be up and about first, achieve something in life, and then we'll have a baby." Even when Zoe got pregnant in her second year of university, he convinced her to have an abortion. The girl cried for a long time, but she could not go against her lover's will. At that moment she did not even think that this abortion could severely affect her body. That's how it happened. Then, years later, she was never able to give birth again. The year she had to give in to her husband's entreaties, she lost a lot of weight and literally dried out. Zoe's soul was torn to shreds, because she dreamed so much about the baby, and she had taken his or her life. At first, she had nightmares of crying babies. But time heals. Gradually she calmed down, accepted her fate, and moved on with her life. When she reached her third year, she dropped out and became a hairdresser. She was sorry to give up the dream of getting an education, but she could no longer ask her husband for money for her studies. At first, he just hinted that it was unnecessary spending, and then he said that her studies were nothing and she should save the family budget. Relationships in the family eventually became completely even. The romance and the passionate kissing were gone. They lived quietly without much emotion. Although among others, her husband was a boisterous, jolly fellow, who was always liked by women regardless of their age. After several years, they decided to have a baby, but since Zoe was deprived of such an opportunity, they used surrogacy. Jason took over picking up the mother and carrying out the entire procedure, which surprised and pleased Zoe a lot. Only the two of them knew about it. For the rest, Zoe went to her husband's relatives for the period of the alleged delivery. When Annie came into the family, the young mother was over the moon. She didn't think for a second that she wasn't her own little girl. Sometimes, looking at her sleeping daughter, she even found her own features in her. Jason, on the other hand, was somehow completely unaffected by the baby. For him, life had not changed after her arrival and he continued to live the way he had lived before. By that time, Zoe knew for sure that her husband was dating other women, but for the sake of her daughter, she was ready to keep the family together and tolerated everything. Jason quickly realized this and no longer lied, trying to justify himself by coming home late. At such moments Zoe regretted only one thing, that she ruined her own career for the sake of his when she'd quit her studies. Since she was a little girl, Annie loved going to all sorts of needlework classes. Her works were often selected for contests and exhibitions. This time she was invited to take part in one of these events. The venue was the City Hall. Zoe and her daughter gathered beforehand and went there with hopes to win. There was a huge amount of people. Children came with their moms, dads, and other relatives. Annie was always supported only by her mother. Her father always found reasons why he couldn't go with them. The festival was a success. There were a lot of creative groups, singing, dancing, and reciting poems. There was an exhibition in the foyer, where a couple of Annie's works were displayed. As a result of the festivities, Annie came in second place, which she was very happy about. While they were going to the cloakroom, a bunch of kids tried to squeeze in without a line, laughing merrily. In this bustle, Zoe lost her daughter, and when she found her, she was surprised why and who had already dressed her in some miserable stuff. Some old woman helped her daughter get dressed. She ran up to the girl and tried to pull her away. The little girl cried frightenedly and started begging, "Ma'am, leave me alone. I want to go to my grandmother. Grandma, take me away from her." Zoe was confused and stood rooted to the spot, not understanding anything. She seemed to be her daughter, but she wasn't. She was crying and didn't recognize her at all. The old woman and the girl walked away, and Zoe heard a familiar voice. "Mommy, Mommy, I lost you." Her daughter was running toward her through the foyer, being already dressed in what they had come in. The girls were very similar, but the look was very different. Annie's was kind and open, while her double's was hunted and frightened. Zoe remembered how the old woman had taken the girl in old stuff and said, "That's all right, darling, it happens. She made a mistake, that's all. We live next door and come here often." Zoe realized that this was not just a coincidence. The girls really did look like the same person. Zoe made up her mind and followed the old woman. She was very surprised but told her everything at once. It turns out that her dissolute daughter gave birth to twin girls, and one gave exactly to Zoe's family, and the other left for herself. The daughter died about 5 years ago, so the old woman began to take care of her granddaughter. The woman went on to say that the man who had arranged for the baby was also supposed to pay a decent sum of money, but he never showed up. Zoe was in shock for a while. She knew, of course, that Jason was far from perfect, but she could not have imagined that he would be so mean to the girls. He simply deprived the sisters of the opportunity to grow up together. Zoe could not stand it and confessed to the woman that her second daughter lived with her. The women cried in each other's arms for a long time. The old woman was stroking Zoe's head and kept saying, "It's okay. The main thing is that both babies are alive and well." When Zoe returned home, it was as if she had seen her husband all over again. He had completely lost his humanity in her eyes after such a heinous act. Perhaps she would have continued to live with Jason as a roommate if she had not seen him kissing her friend in the car. The very next day, Zoe filed for divorce. When the unsuspecting husband returned home, suitcases with his belongings had been already put on the doorstep. Annie now saw her sister Ruby very often. Zoe began to help old Mrs. Louis and her granddaughter regularly. Whenever she had a chance, she went to the cemetery and cleaned the grave of the woman who gave birth to such beautiful girls. One day a man came to her barbershop and wanted a haircut. Zoe was a little lost the whole time he was sitting in the chair, because the visitor was looking at her with a peculiar look, not taking his eyes off her head for a minute. When Zoe had finished her work, he asked, "Young lady, I can't just leave. I'm not going to lie and tell it like it is. I like you very much. Could I walk you out after work?" Zoe blushed a lot, but she also liked this handsome and very suave man. She said yes, which she never regretted. In the evening he met her with a bouquet of flowers, and while they were walking to Zoe's house, they got to talking. Ian, the man's name, was a very interesting conversationalist and very easy to talk to. Since that day Ian often accompanied her home, and on weekends they took Annie and Ruby and went for a walk in the park. He quickly got along with the girls and was racing along the alleys of the park like a boy. 6 months later, Ian proposed to Zoe, and they quietly got married in the registry office without any loud celebrations. He was very affectionate and reverent to Zoe and cared for Annie like his own daughter. About a year later Mrs. Lewis died, and Ian immediately offered to adopt Ruby. Zoe wrapped her arms around her husband's neck and whispered, "I love you so much. How extraordinary you are." He kissed his wife and answered, "I love you and our girls." Soon the family moved into a big house, which was the result of Ian's work. He worked for a very famous construction company, and the management sold this cottage in installments because Ian was one of the best employees. Zoe left her job, as her husband wanted her to devote herself completely to the children and family, and if she wanted, to get a higher education, which she still dreamed about. She was only happy about it, especially since she soon had absolutely no time for work. A real miracle happened. Even the doctors were shocked. When the woman came to see them with complaints of malaise, no one would have thought it could happen. The doctors assembled a whole council, and after rechecking everything several times, they informed her that she was pregnant. At first, Zoe thought she was imagining things and almost fainted, but when she realized what had happened, she cried with joy for a long time. At home, her husband almost showered Zoe with kisses upon learning this happy news. Ian did not allow his wife to do anything during the whole pregnancy. He took over everything, and the daughters happily helped him. They had fun cleaning and cooking. When he went to work, Zoe still tried to pamper the family by cooking something delicious. In due time Zoe and Ian had a beautiful baby boy Justin. The daughters loved to play nannies and took turns patronizing their little brother. Zoe, admiring the children running around the house, was even grateful to her ex-husband. If it were not for his antics and adultery, she may never have met Ian and would not have been happy. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like.